In this video we're going to talk about organisational structure. Now to start, organisational structure should suit the range and variety of tasks. So the structure should be thought out in advance. The variety of tasks, the nature of the product to be produced, or the task to be undertaken by the organisation, that should be at the core of the thinking. That's the centre of the thinking. What functions are needed and what is the best way of doing this? For example, should it be a toll organisation, depending on the amount of output required and the complexity of the output, or should it be a flat organisation? There are various considerations to take into account. Not just simply have an organisation and produce something. It is a question of working out what type of organisation, what structure is required before the business is truly set up and established. There are different possible forms of organisational structure. Generally, businesses group staff and tasks into functions, and then functions into divisions. Well, as I said earlier, it depends critically on the size of the output, the number of units of output required, or the complexity of the units being required. So, but depending on these, sometimes businesses group staff into functions. So one group of staff will do the finance for the business, one group will do the marketing for the business, one group will do research and development, one group will do production, and one group will do distribution, and so on. So we have staff organized into functions, and then these functions may be organized into divisions. But there are many ways in which structures can be worked out. But we may have some staff dedicated to certain functions, some as engineers dedicated to engineering tasks, as you would expect, some finance and some marketing, and these are functional groups. So it depends, of course, on the size of the organisation. If it's a very small organisation, you may find that some staff are doing marketing and some production, because the organisation is so small. Ideally, the organisational structure should minimise bureaucratic costs. Ideally, it should minimise the costs of running the organisation. The organisation should be organised as efficiently as possible so that costs are minimized. So when looking at the organisation, looking at the product, looking at the amount of output required, etc., when looking at all of those factors, it should be designed so as to minimize the cost, allowing for those factors, allowing for the amount of output, allowing for the complexity of the output. It should still attempt to minimize the cost of the organisation. There's a separate video on flat and tall organisations which will address some of these issues. But simply, some organisations may be tall. In other words, the CEO, the Chief Executive Officer, may be remote from production. The senior management may be away in offices on a different site even. In which case there are all sorts of issues about effective communications between the top tier of management and the lower tiers of management. There may be issues not just about communications but about coordination and the whole planning process and the implementation, I should say, of plans. So there are tall and flat organisations, each of which has got advantages and disadvantages, and that's the subject of a separate video. allocating authority and responsibility within organizations is critically important. Who is responsible for what? And how is the organization worked out? How is it planned and delivered? Who in effect is in charge of what? So the limits of responsibility must be determined. The boundaries must be determined for each manager. And there should not be areas not controlled. All of the areas of responsibility, when taken in total, should cover the whole organization. So there should be no areas untouched. There should be someone responsible for every part of the organization. That doesn't mean that there should be a lot of managers. Each manager should be, or could be, responsible for a large part of the organization. It depends. But it's important to allocate the authority and responsibility, and it should also make some sort of logical sense. It should be reasonable that the production manager is responsible for production, for the stores perhaps, for production lines, for equipment, and for the personnel within that sector. It would not make sense to have the same manager perhaps responsible for marketing as well. Simply too much to ask, and also the functions are too different. So it may be the case that that has to be looked at very carefully as to who does what and who is responsible for what. There is a hierarchy of authority, which is the chain of command. Who's above who? Who answers to who? So as you go up the chain of authority, a bit like the toll organization, as you go up the organization, each manager at a higher level is responsible for more and more underneath. But underneath, there will be managers who are responsible for different parts again. So there is a sort of chain of command, very similar to the military. In the army, there are the privates, then the corporals, the sergeants, then there is the second lieutenant, the first lieutenant, the captain, and so on. There is a chain of command. Each manager responsible for what's below him or her. And there's also this concept of the span of control, the number of subordinates. If a manager has a large number of people reporting to him or her, they have a large span of control. That may be a problem, because too many people reporting means that the manager is perhaps overworked, could be stressed. The manager could be taken up in detail and has no time to look critically and logically at the whole process, because on a day-to-day basis they're solving day-to-day problems. There are too many workers, too many people reporting to the manager, so the span of control is too big. If the span of control is too small, the manager may not be used effectively. The manager may have plenty of spare time, spare capacity. So it's a balance to get the span of control correct. And as I said, a lot of this will be to do with the tall and flat organizations. What sort is appropriate? How much output goes through per week or per month? What's the complexity of the output? What's the value of the output? What are the logistical issues associated with the output? And all of this will influence the choice between a tall organization and a flat organization. So those are just some ideas about organizational structure. And I suppose the key concepts here are the hierarchy of authority, the chain of command, as I said earlier, and the span of control. and trying to work out what the ideal span of control is. But that's all we need to do on this session, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.